Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squad for boxing news and views from around the internet. Eddie Hearn has revealed that Dillian Whyte wants 40% to face Anthony Joshua, the sort of money that Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury are being offered. So he's made these statements to IFL TV. This is Hearn. I'll go through the quotes verbatim and then on to some thoughts on that, because 40% now is probably not realistic. And with that in mind, and Hearn obviously knows that Whyte's got more work to do to actually get to 40%. And he's outlined some options for Dillian Whyte should he not face Anthony Joshua. One being Breazeale, one being Povetkin, the other being Ortiz. So I want to work through them and just go through those potential fights and a few thoughts on each. Buckle in. Let's go. So Eddie Hearn, talking to IFL TV, said, I think he feels he should be at the same sort of level as Fury and Wilder at 40%. But to do that, you got to keep winning. You got to keep raising your profile. There's got to be massive public demand for that fight. But the plan now is either do the fight in May or April, or get Dillian out in April in another big fight at the O2 or Manchester Arena. And that's what we're working on at the moment, both options. But looking at Breazeale, looking at Povetkin, looking at Ortiz, those kind of fights for Dillian. And then Eddie Hearn went on to say that those sorts of fights, Breazeale, Povetkin, Ortiz, all gambles, but Whyte has a history of gambling, gambled against Chisora, gambled against Parker, and even fighting Anthony Joshua. That would also be a gamble. And just for context, we know that Dillian Whyte has had multiple offers now, somewhere north of £4 million, but we don't know exactly what he's been offered, if it's a flat fee or if it's a projected split or something, or whatever the case may be, but he's not taking it. And in terms of Dillian Whyte and wanting 40%, this is what Eddie Hearn has said. He wants offers like Fury and Wilder are getting. Does he deserve that? In my opinion, 40%. We don't know what 40% of what is, but on face value, I would say no. He's not as big a star, at least in a boxing sense, as Tyson Fury is and Deontay Wilder. Certainly before the Tyson Fury fight against Deontay Wilder, you could have potentially made a case that Whyte and Fury were potentially on a par, but Tyson Fury has the mantra of being the man who beat the man. He claims to be the lineal champion and that, he really is the man to beat in the division. And obviously with that performance against Wilder, controversial draw, a lot of interest. Tyson Fury is a hot commodity in the heavyweight division right now. And Deontay Wilder, he's also lifted his stock. And that fight with Joshua and Wilder would be for all the belts. And for a Fury and Joshua one, even though Fury doesn't have a belt, he does have that lineal status. He beat Vladimir Klitschko, something in common with Anthony Joshua. And it is a much bigger and better fight, in my opinion, and probably a tougher fight for Anthony Joshua stylistically than a Dillian Whyte fight. And the problem that Dillian Whyte has is we've been there, done that, got the postcard. We saw that just over 3 years ago, and he was knocked out. And to some extent, we're never going to, for Dillian Whyte at least, get away from that. Since then, he's built his profile, built his brand, built his worth in the division. He's remained unbeaten. He's got some good names on his record. Robert Helenius, Lucas Brown, Joseph Parker. That Parker win's probably his best win. And also Derek Chisora most recently. That was in December 2018. Knocked him out in the 11th round. But a clash with Joshua, a rematch, that was sort of seen as the backup option for Anthony Joshua. And even in a poll with fans, that Joshua did on his Twitter some months ago, it had 53% for Wilder, 42% for Fury, and 5% for Dillian Whyte. And just on that basic measure alone, there's not as much interest in a Dillian Whyte fight as there is with those other two fights. And hence, interest also, more often than not, can translate into more commercial value because there's more demand for those fights. That's just one really basic measure. But they've talked about Fury and Joshua being potentially the biggest fight in British history. And they're not talking about that, about a rematch for Dillian Whyte. So 40% as it stands at the moment, if this is truly what he wants, it is, in my view, a bit unreasonable, and we're not going to see a fight made. He can probably get to 40%, but he probably needs to have another fight or two to get there. Because right now, Dillian Whyte, his star power in terms of being a commercial pay-per-view success, it's still a work in progress. He's had a couple of good events under his belt. We don't know the exact numbers in terms of revenue generated and that sort of thing, but he's his own burgeoning industry at the moment. So if he had a couple more pay-per-view events and if he keeps winning and he keeps building that brand and the demand for an Anthony Joshua rematch, then he could get it at the sort of rate, the money that he wants. And who knows, if he keeps winning, he may end up being like some of these other guys and wanting 50-50. But the key thing for me is, it's the demand thing at the moment that's stopping him from getting 40%. There is demand for a Tyson Fury fight with Anthony Joshua. High demand. There is a demand for a Deontay Wilder fight. High demand. The demand for a Dillian Whyte fight, it's not as much. Not nearly as much. That poll proved it, but also just in general, the way people are talking about it, it's more sort of, they've got the sort of 1-2 options that they'd rather see first, and then Dillian Whyte is generally, the sort of third option. Sometimes the fourth option for some people who'd prefer to see a Jarrell Miller fight ahead of a Dillian Whyte fight, just because Miller is someone that Joshua hasn't fought yet, and that could be a US debut for Joshua to fight in, look good in, build his brand and, legacy, add to it in the United States and have that first overseas fight. So Dillian Whyte kind of has a couple of things sort of holding him back here. And it's not for a lack of trying and effort in the ring, because obviously he's been doing all he can. He's been starting to bring the money in the door for Eddie Hearn on pay-per-view events. And that's probably for Eddie Hearn, if this fight with Dillian Whyte doesn't happen, it's not the end of the world, because he's not sort of cutting off one of his pay-per-view stars. And Dillian Whyte, has only just got onto pay-per-view, and if he can keep winning for another few fights before he faced Joshua, well, he's Eddie Hearn is able to bring more money in the door than he otherwise would have if Dillian Whyte gets beaten, because the likelihood if he got beaten by Joshua next is he's probably not on pay-per-view immediately. He might have to build back up to that. Sometimes with these guys who are on the cusp of pay-per-view, because some of these fights are on the cusp of pay-per-view. I mean, arguably Chisora and Whyte was a marginal, outside of the United Kingdom, not a whole lot of interest for that. Even within the United Kingdom, it was competing with another fight on the night. We don't know what sort of numbers it did in the end. But obviously, it was a good fight with Chisora in the end, and Dillian Whyte got the knockout that he wanted and needed to help sort of build him a little bit further. And he does have a bit more building to go. I think if he wants to get to 40%, certainly a win over Breazeale, Ortiz or Povetkin, it's going to help him get closer to that. And if he was to ever to get to 50%, he's going to need to get a belt or something behind him to actually bring that to the table. Because right now, all he has is some fans, but nothing much else. There's no belt. There's no title that he can sort of say, look, we're unifying the division, or something like that. And that's why probably whatever he's being offered, if it's a flat fee or a lower sort of split, 25-30%, I can understand why it would be lower. But we don't know what the sort of pot that they're talking about is here. So it's hard to judge, how good the offer is, because for all we know, Joshua might be getting £20 million and the offer to Whyte might be 5. That's just hypothetical. We just don't really know what it is. But clearly Dillian Whyte is unhappy with what he's been offered, and he's been shopping himself around in the United States a little bit because he's on a fight-by-fight deal with Eddie Hearn, so he can go elsewhere if he chooses. I think he stays with Eddie Hearn, and I think they will look to set up one of these other fights that Hearn has talked about. And if we go to them really quickly, so Dominic Breazeale, I think that's the most likely option. And if Wilder and Fury rematch, the WBC will have to deal with mandatory challenger Breazeale, set him up in a fight. And, the guy who will be Johnny on the spot to take that fight with him, because they will have to go down the WBC rankings and Whyte is number 1, Dillian Whyte will get that fight with Breazeale if he so chooses. That would be a good fight for Whyte. He would be able to, because Breazeale is just so hittable. Slow, plodding, but he punches hard. So there is some risk there, but Dillian Whyte would be favoured to win that, and probably win it well. Breazeale can be hurt, especially to the body. We saw Izuagono piecing him up when they met in February 2017. But just as Agono found out, Breazeale hits hard, and if he clips you, you can feel it and go down and be knocked out. And Whyte has been hurt there in the ring before by a number of fighters. Alexander Povetkin, that's another option, because Povetkin, he was to be fighting, supposedly, in London in April. This is the sort of, what they were saying a few months ago. and that was, probably going to be on Joshua's undercard. And if there's no undercard in April at Wembley, well, then Povetkin is kind of at a loose end. So you could set that fight up for maybe May or June. Have it, at the O2, have Dillian Whyte taking on Povetkin, and that could be a common opponent to help Dillian Whyte build towards a Joshua fight. There's a lot of risk there because Alexander Povetkin showed against Anthony Joshua, those early rounds, he can be lethal. The guy can still fight, he's quick, he can box, and he can crack. Luis Ortiz. Now this is the most interesting one for me just because I'm just not sure it would get made. Remember when there was the potential for Derek Chisora and Luis Ortiz sort of responded to Dillian Whyte's sort of, come and fight me, and he said, okay, I'll come and fight. And then Eddie Hearn poured cold water on that and basically sort of said it was a fight for the hardcore. Effectively saying that it wasn't the sort of fight that he could run, have it on pay-per-view. But, I think if they were to ever make that fight, and I'm not sure they will, I'm sure we would hear something completely different. We'd hear how Ortiz is a dangerous threat in the division, the guy that almost beat Deontay Wilder, and I'm sure they would be looking to sell the heck out of it in the United Kingdom on pay-per-view. You can bet your bottom dollar on that. So the sort of lines from Hearn last year about Ortiz being more for the hardcore, I think that was just a good excuse at the time to really sell the Chisora fight to the public, because that was what they were looking to do. It was going to probably, in their minds and in reality, make the most money out of the options that were available at the time. But I think the Dominic Breazeale fight is the most likely fight for Dillian Whyte if he doesn't choose to fight Anthony Joshua next. And it's down to money because Dillian Whyte wants more than Anthony Joshua is willing to pay at this time. And we're hearing that he wants 40%. And what Hearn is saying is he can get it, but he's just got to keep working towards that. So we'll have to see where it goes. What do you make of those potential fights? Breazeale, Povetkin, Ortiz. What's the most likely for you? And what do you make of this wanting 40%? Similar money to Tyson Fury, to Deontay Wilder. Does Dillian Whyte deserve it now, or does he need to keep winning as Eddie Hearn suggests he does? Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter. Boxing_squared. I'm out.